The rain hammered against the windows of the military transport vehicle as it wound through the mountainous terrain toward Fort Harrison. Inside, Captain Marcus Chun stared out at the gray landscape, his jaw tight with frustration. 3 months of disciplinary action at this remote base felt like a lifetime sentence. His superior officers had made it clear that his aggressive tendencies and inability to follow orders without question had finally caught up with him. Marcus had always been a soldier who spoke his mind, even when it meant challenging authority. His last assignment had ended in disaster when he'd questioned a mission that put civilian lives at risk. The brass didn't appreciate his moral stance, and now he was paying the price with what they called a character-building assignment at one of the most isolated military installations in the country. Fort Harrison sat like a fortress carved into the mountainside, its gray concrete walls blending seamlessly with the stormy sky. As the transport pulled through the main gates, Marcus caught sight of soldiers moving with crisp precision across the courtyard. Everything here looked regulation perfect, which only deepened his sense of dread. He'd heard rumors about this place, whispers that it was where problem soldiers were sent to be broken down and rebuilt into compliant machines. The vehicle stopped in front of the main administrative building, and Marcus grabbed his duffel bag. The driver, a grizzled sergeant with tired eyes, looked back at him with something that might have been sympathy. "Word of advice, Captain," the sergeant said quietly. "Keep your head down here. The commanding officer doesn't tolerate troublemakers, and rumor has it they've got some new policies that make the old disciplinary measures look like summer camp." Marcus nodded curtly and stepped out into the driving rain. The cold mountain air hit him like a slap, and he pulled his jacket tighter as he jogged toward the building entrance. Inside, the corridors were eerily quiet, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that cast everything in stark black and white. His footsteps echoed as he made his way to the processing office, following the signs posted at regular intervals. The processing took 2 hours of mind-numbing paperwork and medical checks. By the time he was assigned his quarters and given his duty roster, the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the base. His room was spartanly furnished with a narrow bed, a metal desk, and a small window that looked out over the training grounds. He unpacked his few belongings methodically, each item a reminder of the career he'd built and the reputation he destroyed with his stubborn principles. His first week at Fort Harrison passed in a blur of routine assignments and careful observation. Marcus quickly learned that the base operated under an iron discipline that made his previous postings seem relaxed by comparison. Soldiers moved with mechanical precision, spoke only when spoken to, and followed orders without the slightest hesitation. It was unsettling in a way that made his skin crawl. The other officers kept their distance from him, and Marcus suspected word of his disciplinary issues had spread quickly through the ranks. He didn't mind the isolation. It gave him time to study the base's operations and try to understand what made this place so different from every other military installation he'd served at. What troubled him most were the small inconsistencies he began to notice. Soldiers would disappear for days at a time, returning with a glassy-eyed look that suggested either intensive training or something darker. Supply shipments arrived at odd hours under heavy security, and there were areas of the base that seemed completely off-limits, even to officers of his rank. On his 8th day at Fort Harrison, Marcus was assigned to night patrol duty. The assignment came without explanation, just a terse note slipped under his door with the time and location. As he suited up in the required tactical gear, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was some kind of test. The patrol route took him through the outer perimeter of the base, along paths that wound between storage facilities and training areas he hadn't seen during daylight hours. His partner was a silent corporal who communicated only through hand signals and seemed to treat every shadow as a potential threat. The man's nervousness was contagious, and Marcus found himself gripping his weapon tighter as they moved through the darkness. They were checking the locks on a series of storage units when Marcus heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the mountain wilderness surrounding the base. It was faint but unmistakable, someone crying. The sound seemed to be coming from one of the supposedly empty buildings they'd just passed. Marcus stopped and held up a hand to his partner. "Did you hear that?" The corporal's eyes darted nervously around the area before he shook his head quickly. Too quickly. Marcus was certain the man had heard it too, but was choosing to ignore it. The crying came again, clearer this time, and Marcus felt his protective instincts kick in despite every rational thought telling him to stay on patrol and mind his own business. "I'm going to check it out," Marcus whispered. The corporal grabbed his arm and shook his head frantically, pointing toward their radio and making a slashing motion across his throat. The message was clear. Whatever was happening in that building wasn't supposed to be reported or investigated. Marcus stared at the man for a long moment, weighing his options. He could follow orders, complete his patrol, and pretend he'd never heard anything. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing that wouldn't jeopardize his already damaged career. But as the crying continued, soft and desperate in the darkness, he knew he couldn't walk away. He pulled his arm free from the corporal's grip and moved toward the sound. Behind him, he could hear his partner reluctantly following, probably more afraid of being left alone than of whatever they might find. The building was one of several that looked like converted barracks, with small windows set high in concrete walls. Marcus circled the structure until he found a window low enough to peer through. What he saw inside made his blood run cold. The room was set up like some kind of holding facility, with metal beds bolted to the floor and restraints that had clearly seen recent use. But it was the figure huddled in the corner that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. It was a woman in military fatigues, but her uniform was torn and dirty, and she was curled up like someone who'd been through hell. Marcus's military training warred with his human instincts as he processed what he was seeing. This wasn't a standard detention facility. It was something darker, something that violated every code of military justice he'd ever sworn to uphold. The woman looked up toward the window, and even in the dim light, he could see the fear and desperation in her eyes. Without thinking, Marcus tried the building's main door. It was locked, but the lock was old and poorly maintained. A few minutes of work with his knife had it open, and he slipped inside with his partner reluctantly trailing behind. The woman scrambled to her feet as they entered, pressing herself against the far wall with the desperate energy of someone who'd learned not to trust anyone in uniform. She was small and slight, but there was something in her posture that suggested military training. Her dark hair was tangled and dirty, but her eyes were sharp and alert despite her obvious exhaustion. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. Marcus holstered his weapon and held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "Captain Marcus Chun. I heard you crying and came to help. What's your name? How did you get here?" The woman studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he could be trusted. "I can't tell you my name," she said finally, "but I've been here for 3 days. They brought me here after." She trailed off, shaking her head. "After what?" Marcus pressed gently. "After I refused to authorize something that would have gotten innocent people killed. They said I needed attitude adjustment." She laughed bitterly. Turns out attitude adjustment involves being locked up like an animal and subjected to psychological pressure techniques that would make a war criminal blush. Marcus felt his anger building as he processed her words. This was exactly the kind of institutional corruption that had gotten him into trouble at his last posting, but seeing it firsthand made his blood boil. "We're getting you out of here," he said firmly. The corporal grabbed his arm again, this time with real panic in his eyes. He pointed toward his radio and made urgent gestures that Marcus interpreted as warnings about calling for backup or reporting what they'd found. "He's right to be scared," the woman said, having watched their silent exchange. "This place operates outside normal military oversight. The people running it have connections that go all the way to the top. If you help me, you'll be signing your own death warrant." Marcus looked between the terrified corporal and the exhausted woman, feeling the familiar weight of a decision that would define his character. He'd spent his entire career following his conscience, even when it cost him promotions and assignments he'd wanted. Now he was facing the biggest test of his principles yet. "I didn't become a soldier to abandon people who need help," he said quietly. "We're leaving here together, all 3 of us, and we're going to expose whatever sick operation this is." The woman's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they seemed to be tears of relief rather than despair. "You don't understand the risk you're taking." "I understand enough," Marcus replied, moving to check the corridor outside. "Sometimes doing the right thing means risking everything. I learned that lesson a long time ago." As they prepared to leave the building, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple rescue mission. The woman moved with a confidence that suggested high-level military training, and Her knowledge of the base's operation seemed far too detailed for an ordinary prisoner. But those questions would have to wait. Right now, his focus was on getting all three of them away from his facility and to someone who could help them expose the truth about what was happening at Fort Harrison. As they slipped into the darkness of the mountain night, Marcus wondered if his career in the military was about to end in disgrace, or if this was the moment he'd finally found a cause worth fighting for, regardless of the consequences. The rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy with moisture and tension as they made their way toward the perimeter fence. Behind them, the lights of Fort Harrison glowed against the mountainside like the eyes of some sleeping monster, and Marcus knew that when it woke up, all hell was going to break loose. The escape from Fort Harrison proved easier than Marcus had expected, which only increased his suspicions about what they'd stumbled into. The perimeter fence that should have been heavily monitored had convenient gaps in its sensor coverage, and the guard rotation seemed deliberately designed to create windows of opportunity for someone who knew the patterns. The woman, who still refused to give her name, moved through the darkness with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this kind of thing before. She led them along paths that avoided the main security checkpoints and seemed to know exactly where the surveillance cameras were positioned. Marcus began to wonder if this rescue was actually an elaborate setup. They reached the outer fence line just as dawn was beginning to break over the mountains. The corporal who'd been with Marcus on patrol had grown increasingly agitated during their escape, constantly checking his radio and jumping at every sound. When they finally stopped to rest in a grove of trees outside the base perimeter, he couldn't contain himself any longer. "This is insane," he whispered frantically. "They're going to notice she's missing, and when they do, they'll know exactly who took her. We're all dead men." The woman studied the corporal with an expression that seemed almost amused despite their circumstances. "What's your name, soldier?" "Corporal Davis, ma'am. And, with all due respect, I think we should turn back before this gets any worse. Tell me, Corporal Davis," she continued, her voice taking on an authoritative tone that made Marcus take notice. "How long have you been stationed at Fort Harrison?" "6 months, ma'am." "And in those 6 months, how many times have you seen prisoners being held in that facility?" Davis's face went pale. I can't answer that, ma'am." "You can't or you won't?" she pressed. "Because there's a difference, and that difference matters when we're talking about violations of military law that could land everyone involved in federal prison." Marcus watched this exchange with growing fascination. The woman's manner of questioning was sophisticated and practiced, like someone used to conducting official interrogations. Her knowledge of military law seemed detailed and current. Most telling was the way Corporal Davis had begun addressing her as ma'am without being asked to do so. "Who are you really?" Marcus asked quietly. She turned to look at him, and for the first time since he'd found her, he saw something other than exhaustion and fear in her eyes. There was steel there, and authority, and something that looked almost like respect for his question. "I'm someone who's been investigating illegal activities at Fort Harrison for the past 3 months, she said carefully. "Someone who got too close to the truth and needed to disappear for a while." "Investigating for who?" Marcus pressed. Before she could answer, the sound of helicopters echoed across the valley. They were still distant, but clearly searching in a grid pattern that would eventually cover their location. The woman was on her feet instantly, all traces of vulnerability gone from her demeanor. "We need to move. There's a safe house about 5 miles from here, but we'll have to travel during daylight, which means staying off the main roads and avoiding open areas where aircraft can spot us." She took charge of their route with an efficiency that left no room for argument. Marcus found himself following her lead despite being the highest-ranking officer present, and even Corporal Davis seemed to accept her authority without question. They moved through dense forest and rocky terrain for hours, always staying under cover when possible. During their trek, Marcus tried to piece together what he'd learned about Fort Harrison and the woman he was helping to escape. The base was supposedly a standard disciplinary facility, but the security measures and specialized equipment he'd observed suggested something more sophisticated. The woman's knowledge of military procedures and her natural assumption of command indicated high-level training and experience. Most disturbing were the implications of what she'd told them about refusing to authorize something that would have killed innocent people. That suggested she'd been in a position to make life and death decisions, which narrowed down her possible identity considerably. They reached the safe house just as the afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows through the trees. It was a small cabin that looked abandoned from the outside, but proved to be well stocked with supplies and communication equipment. The woman immediately went to a radio setup that looked military-grade and began transmitting coded messages. Marcus watched her work with growing certainty about who she really was. Her fingers moved over the equipment with practiced ease, and the responses she received were clearly from official sources. When she finished her communications, she turned to face both men with an expression that had transformed from desperate refugee to commanding officer. "Gentlemen," she said formally, "before we go any further, you need to understand exactly what you've gotten yourselves involved in. The investigation I mentioned isn't some independent fact-finding mission. It's an official inquiry ordered by the Joint Chiefs of Staff into activities at Fort Harrison that may constitute war crimes." Corporal Davis sank into a chair with the look of someone who'd just realized he was in far deeper trouble than he'd imagined. Marcus remained standing, his mind racing as he processed the implications of her statement. "War crimes," he repeated slowly. "What kind of war crimes?" "Illegal detention and interrogation of military personnel, unauthorized psychological experiments, falsification of military records to cover up deaths and injuries, and possibly murder of soldiers who tried to report what was happening." The room fell silent except for the crackling of the radio and the sound of their breathing. Marcus felt the familiar surge of anger that came whenever he encountered institutional corruption, but this was beyond anything he'd imagined possible in the modern military. "The facility where you found me," she continued, "is just one part of a larger operation. They've been using Fort Harrison as a testing ground for interrogation techniques and psychological manipulation methods that violate every international treaty on the treatment of military personnel." "Why were you being held there?" Marcus asked. "Because I discovered evidence that some of the techniques being tested were later used on captured enemy combatants in violation of the Geneva Conventions. When I tried to report my findings, I was told that the program was classified beyond my clearance level and that any further investigation would be considered insubordination." "So you continued investigating anyway," Marcus concluded. "I continued investigating anyway," she confirmed, "which led to my disappearance and imprisonment in the facility you found me in. They were trying to break me down psychologically to get me to recant my findings and sign a statement saying I'd made everything up." Corporal Davis looked up from his chair with an expression of pure terror. "Ma'am, if what you're saying is true, then everyone at that base is going to be looking for us. And when they find us, they won't find us," she said with quiet confidence. "Because as of 1 hour ago, this investigation officially became a federal matter. FBI agents and military police are en route to Fort Harrison with warrants to search the facility and arrest everyone involved in the illegal activities." Marcus stared at her as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. "You're not just an investigator. You're the commanding officer who ordered this investigation." She nodded slowly. "Rear Admiral Sarah Mitchell, Office of Military Justice. I've been working undercover for 3 months to gather evidence against the officers running the illegal program at Fort Harrison." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd spent the last 24 hours helping the commanding admiral escape from her own investigation, never suspecting that her capture had been anything other than a tragic mistake. Now he realized that everything from his assignment to Fort Harrison to his patrol route that night had been carefully orchestrated. "You knew," he said, his voice heavy with understanding. "You knew I'd be on patrol that night. You knew I'd investigate when I heard you crying. This whole rescue was planned." Admiral Mitchell's expression softened slightly. "Your reputation for moral courage and willingness to challenge authority preceded you, Captain Chun. When I needed someone I could trust to help me gather the final piece of evidence I needed, your name was at the top of my list." "What final piece of evidence?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Proof that the facility was being used to illegally detain and interrogate military personnel. I needed to experience it firsthand and have a credible witness to testify about what they found there." Marcus felt a mixture of admiration and anger at the realization that he'd been manipulated, even for a noble cause. "You could have told me the truth from the beginning. I couldn't risk it," Admiral Mitchell replied. "If you'd known who I was and what we were doing, your reactions wouldn't have been genuine. The evidence we collected tonight will help convict everyone involved in this conspiracy, but only because your response was completely authentic." Corporal Davis had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. "Ma'am, what's going to happen to those of us who were stationed there, but didn't know about the illegal activities?" "That depends on what you did or didn't do once you became aware of them," Admiral Mitchell said carefully. "Every person at Fort Harrison will be investigated, but we're looking for the perpetrators, not the victims or unwilling participants." She turned back to Marcus. "Captain Shun, your actions over the past day have demonstrated exactly the kind of moral courage the military needs. When this investigation is complete, I'll be recommending you for promotion and transfer to a position where your principles will be an asset rather than a liability." Marcus shook his head. "I didn't do this for career advancement. I did it because it was the right thing to do." "I know," Admiral Mitchell said with a small smile. "That's exactly why you're the kind of officer the military needs more of." As they waited for the federal agents to arrive and take them into protective custody, Marcus reflected on the events that had brought him to this moment. His stubborn refusal to compromise his principles had cost him promotions and assignments throughout his career, but it had also led him to this opportunity to help expose serious crimes and protect future victims. He looked at Admiral Mitchell, who was once again monitoring radio communications, and felt a grudging respect for her willingness to put herself at risk to gather evidence against corruption in her own ranks. It took a special kind of courage to go undercover in a dangerous situation, even when you had backup plans and support networks. The sound of vehicles approaching through the forest interrupted his thoughts. Admiral Mitchell confirmed through her radio that the arrivals were the federal agents they'd been expecting, and the three of them prepared to face whatever came next. As they walked out to meet their escorts, Marcus realized that this experience had taught him something important about the nature of command and responsibility. Sometimes the people with the most authority were the ones who took the greatest personal risks to protect those under their command. And sometimes the best way to serve your country was to challenge the very institution you'd sworn to defend. The agents who took them into custody were professional and courteous, treating Admiral Mitchell with the respect due her rank while carefully documenting everything that had happened during their escape from Fort Harrison. Marcus knew that the coming weeks would involve extensive debriefings and testimony, but he also knew that they'd done something important. As their vehicle pulled away from the safe house and headed toward civilization, Marcus caught Admiral Mitchell's eye in the reflection of the window. She nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect between two soldiers who understood that sometimes doing your duty meant risking everything you'd worked for. The mountain peaks of Fort Harrison disappeared behind them, but Marcus knew the real battle was just beginning. The federal building in Denver felt like a fortress after the wilderness of Fort Harrison. Marcus had spent 3 days in protective custody, giving detailed statements to FBI agents, military investigators, and attorneys from the Judge Advocate General's office. Each interview revealed new layers of the conspiracy that had been operating at Fort Harrison, and Marcus began to understand just how deep the corruption ran. Admiral Mitchell had been housed in a different section of the building, and Marcus hadn't seen her since their arrival. He'd heard through the agents that she was providing extensive testimony about her undercover investigation, but the specifics were classified beyond his clearance level. It frustrated him to be kept in the dark about the case he'd helped break open, but he understood the need for operational security. On his 4th morning in custody, Marcus was surprised when an agent informed him that Admiral Mitchell had requested a meeting with him. They were escorted to a secure conference room where she was waiting with a stack of files and a laptop computer. She looked completely different from the desperate woman he'd found in that illegal detention facility. Her uniform was crisp and professional, her hair was neatly styled, and her bearing radiated the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Captain Shun," she said, rising to shake his hand formally. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Please have a seat." Marcus settled into the chair across from her, noting how the dynamics between them had shifted now that her true identity was revealed. The woman he'd rescued was gone, replaced by a flag officer who outranked him by several levels. "I wanted to brief you personally on the results of the investigation," Admiral Mitchell began, opening one of her files. "The raid on Fort Harrison uncovered evidence that exceeded even our worst expectations. We found documentation of illegal experiments going back 3 years, involving over 200 military personnel who were subjected to psychological torture techniques without their knowledge or consent." Marcus felt his stomach clench at the numbers. 200 people. Most of them thought they were participating in routine psychological evaluations or stress testing. They had no idea they were actually guinea pigs for techniques designed to break down human resistance to interrogation. Admiral Mitchell's voice was clinical, but Marcus could hear the anger underneath her professional demeanor. What happened to the people running the program? Colonel Reeves, the base commander, and his entire staff are in federal custody facing charges that include conspiracy, torture, violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and murder. Murder? Admiral Mitchell pulled out a photograph and slid it across the table. It showed a young soldier Marcus didn't recognize, but the haunted look in a man's eyes was familiar from other soldiers who'd seen too much combat. Lieutenant David Park. He was one of the test subjects who tried to report what was happening to him. 3 days after he filed a complaint with the Inspector General's office, he was found dead in his quarters. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, but our investigation found evidence that he was murdered to prevent his testimony. Marcus stared at the photograph, feeling the weight of how close they'd come to a similar fate. How many others? We're still investigating, but we've identified at least 4 suspicious deaths among personnel who tried to report illegal activities at Fort Harrison. The full scope of the conspiracy may not be known for months. They sat in silence for a moment as Marcus processed the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. Finally, Admiral Mitchell closed the file and looked at him directly. Captain Chun, I need to ask you something important. During your time at Fort Harrison, did you observe anything that suggested the illegal activities extended beyond that base? Marcus thought back to his observations during his brief stay. There were supply shipments that came in under unusual security protocols, and some of the personnel seemed to have knowledge of procedures that wouldn't normally be taught at a disciplinary facility. Can you be more specific about the supply shipments? They arrived at night, always with armed escorts that seemed excessive for standard military supplies. The vehicles had federal license plates rather than military ones, and the cargo was always taken directly to areas of the base that were off-limits to most personnel. Admiral Mitchell made notes as he spoke. This confirms what we suspected. The program at Fort Harrison was just one node in a larger network of illegal activities. We're tracking similar operations at bases across the country. The revelation that Fort Harrison was part of a nationwide conspiracy sent a chill through Marcus. He thought they were dealing with a localized problem, not something that could involve hundreds or thousands of additional victims. What's being done about the other bases? Simultaneous raids are being conducted as we speak. By the end of this week, we expect to have dismantled the entire network. Admiral Mitchell paused, studying his face. But that brings me to another matter I need to discuss with you. Marcus waited, sensing that whatever came next would be significant. The investigation has revealed that your transfer to Fort Harrison wasn't random. You were specifically selected because someone in the conspiracy wanted to neutralize your ability to report on illegal activities you might observe. Someone knew I was a problem. More than that, someone wanted you to become a victim of the program. Your psychological profile indicated that you would be resistant to the techniques they were testing, which made you a valuable test subject. Marcus felt a surge of anger at the realization that his entire military career had been manipulated by corrupt officers who saw him as nothing more than a laboratory animal. However, Admiral Mitchell continued, your selection for the program also means you are in a unique position to help us prevent this kind of thing from happening again. What do you mean? The Department of Defense is creating a new oversight division specifically designed to investigate and prevent illegal activities within the military. It will operate with broad authority and direct access to the highest levels of command. She paused. I'm being asked to head this division, and I want you to be my deputy director. Marcus stared at her in shock. He'd expected his involvement in the Fort Harrison investigation to be the end of his military career, not the beginning of a promotion to a position with real authority to create change. Why me? Because you've demonstrated that you'll do the right thing even when it costs you personally. Because you have the moral courage to challenge authority when necessary. And because you understand firsthand what happens to soldiers when the system fails them. The offer was everything Marcus had ever wanted in terms of having the power to make a difference, but he also understood the risks involved. Creating enemies among corrupt officers could be dangerous, especially when those officers had already proven willing to commit murder to protect their secrets. What will my responsibilities be? You'd lead field investigations into suspected illegal activities. You'd have a team of specially selected investigators, and the authority to access any military facility without warning. Most importantly, you'd have protection from retaliation that other whistleblowers haven't had. Marcus thought about Lieutenant Park and the other soldiers who died trying to expose the truth. What kind of protection? Direct reporting authority to the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs. Federal law enforcement backup for dangerous situations. And legal immunity for actions taken in the course of legitimate investigations. The scope of the authority being offered was impressive, but Marcus had one more question that needed to be answered before he could make his decision. Admiral, why are you really offering me this position? Is it because of what happened at Fort Harrison, or is there something else? Admiral Mitchell smiled for the first time since he'd entered the room. Captain Chun, do you remember what you said when you found me in that detention facility? Marcus thought back to that night, trying to recall his exact words. I said we were getting you out of there. You said you didn't become a soldier to abandon people who need help. That sometimes doing the right thing means risking everything. She leaned forward. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need in this new division. Not someone who follows orders blindly, but someone who understands that the ultimate mission is protecting people. Marcus felt the familiar weight of a decision that would define his future, but this time the choice felt clear. Everything in his career had led to this moment, and he knew he couldn't walk away from an opportunity to prevent other soldiers from experiencing what he'd witnessed at Fort Harrison. When would I start? Immediately. We have credible intelligence about illegal activities at 3 more installations that require urgent investigation. Your first assignment will be to lead a team into Fort McKenzie to investigate reports of unauthorized medical experiments on combat veterans. The mention of medical experiments on veterans made Marcus's blood run cold. He'd seen enough at Fort Harrison to know what that probably meant, and the thought of veterans being subjected to illegal treatments after already serving their country filled him with rage. I accept, he said without hesitation. Admiral Mitchell nodded with satisfaction. I knew you would. Your formal promotion to major will be processed within the week, along with your security clearances and assignment to the new division. As they discussed the practical details of his new position, Marcus realized that his relationship with Admiral Mitchell was evolving into something more complex than a simple superior-subordinate dynamic. They'd shared an experience at Fort Harrison that created a bond of trust and mutual respect that went beyond rank and protocol. Admiral, he said as their meeting was concluding, I want you to know that I understand what you risked by going undercover. A lot of officers in your position would have assigned someone else to take that kind of personal risk. A lot of officers in my position created the problems we're trying to solve, she replied. Leadership means being willing to do things yourself that you wouldn't ask others to do. As Marcus left the conference room, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since joining the military. For the first time in his career, his principles and his duties were perfectly aligned, and he had the authority to make a real difference in the lives of soldiers who needed protection from their own institution. The war against corruption within the military was just beginning, but Marcus knew he was exactly where he needed to be, working alongside someone who understood that the real enemy wasn't always wearing a foreign uniform. Behind him, Admiral Mitchell was already preparing for their next mission, and Marcus realized that the woman he'd rescued from that detention facility had actually rescued him from a career of frustration and compromise. Sometimes he thought, the people who look like they need saving are actually the ones doing the saving. The mountain peaks of Fort Harrison were far behind them now, but the real work of cleaning up the military was just getting started. 6 months had passed since Marcus accepted his position as Deputy Director of the Military Ethics Oversight Division, and the work had been both more rewarding and more dangerous than he'd anticipated. Their investigation into Fort McKenzie had uncovered a network of illegal medical experiments that made the psychological torture at Fort Harrison look routine by comparison. Veterans suffering from PTSD and traumatic brain injuries were being used as test subjects for experimental treatments without their informed consent, and several had died from procedures that were never approved for human testing. The success of their investigations had also made them targets. 2 attempts had been made on Marcus's life, both carefully disguised as accidents that would have been impossible to prove were actually assassination attempts. Admiral Mitchell had received death threats that were sophisticated enough to suggest they came from people with access to classified information about her personal security arrangements. Despite the dangers, or perhaps because of them, Marcus found himself developing feelings for Admiral Mitchell that went far beyond professional respect. Working closely with her every day had revealed layers of her personality that weren't visible during their formal interactions. She was brilliant, compassionate, and absolutely fearless when it came to protecting soldiers under her command. She also had a dry sense of humor that emerged during their late-night strategy sessions, and a vulnerability that she showed only when they were alone. Marcus knew that any romantic relationship between them would be both inappropriate and professionally dangerous, but he couldn't deny the attraction he felt. More troubling was his growing suspicion that the feelings were mutual. Admiral Mitchell had begun finding excuses to extend their working meetings, and she'd started sharing personal details about her background that weren't relevant to their professional relationship. Their current investigation had brought them to Fort Braxton, a sprawling training facility in North Carolina where reports suggested that female soldiers were being subjected to illegal interrogation techniques designed to simulate sexual assault. The allegations were so serious that the Secretary of Defense had personally ordered their investigation to take priority over all other cases. Marcus was reviewing intelligence reports in his hotel room when a knock at the door interrupted his concentration. He opened it to find Admiral Mitchell standing in the hallway, still in her duty uniform, but looking exhausted after their 14-hour day of interviews and document review. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "May I come in?" Marcus stepped aside to let her enter, noting the tension in her shoulders and the way she avoided making eye contact. She walked to the window overlooking the bays and stood with her back to him for a long moment before speaking. "I've been reviewing the testimony we collected today," she said quietly. "The pattern of abuse at this facility is more systematic than anything we've encountered before." Marcus had reached the same conclusion from his analysis of the evidence. It looks like someone was using female recruits for training purposes, teaching interrogators how to exploit psychological vulnerabilities specific to women. "It's worse than that," Admiral Mitchell said, turning to face him. "They were creating a handbook for torture techniques that could be used against female prisoners of war. Everything they did to our own soldiers was research for methods they planned to use against enemy combatants." The implications of what she was suggesting made Marcus feel sick. That would violate every international law governing the treatment of prisoners, which is why the people responsible are willing to kill to prevent exposure. Admiral Mitchell moved away from the window and sat down heavily in the room's single chair. "Marcus, I need to tell you something that's going to change our entire investigation." Marcus remained standing, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal would be significant. "I received a classified briefing yesterday from the Director of National Intelligence. The torture techniques being developed at Fort Braxton and the other facilities we've investigated aren't just for military use. They're part of a larger program designed to create interrogation methods for domestic counterintelligence operations." Marcus stared at her as the implications sank in. "You're talking about torture techniques designed for use against American citizens, specifically against Americans suspected of terrorism or sedition. The entire program was developed under the justification that enhanced interrogation techniques might be necessary to prevent domestic terrorist attacks." The revelation transformed everything Marcus thought he understood about their investigation. They weren't just dealing with corrupt military officers abusing their authority. They were uncovering a conspiracy that threatened the constitutional rights of every American citizen. "How high does this go?" he asked quietly. "High enough that my briefing yesterday included a strong suggestion that our investigation should focus only on the military aspects of the program and avoid looking into the civilian applications." Marcus felt the familiar anger that came whenever he encountered institutional pressure to compromise his principles. "They're trying to limit our investigation to protect the people at the top." "Exactly, which means we have a choice to make. We can follow our orders and focus only on the military violations, or we can expand our investigation to include the civilian conspiracy and risk everything we've built." Marcus looked at her carefully, noting the way she was studying his reaction. "What do you want to do?" Admiral Mitchell stood and moved closer to him, close enough that he could see the exhaustion and stress in her eyes. "I want to follow the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of who gets hurt or what it costs us personally. Even if it means risking our careers and possibly our lives. Especially if it means that." She paused, seeming to gather courage for what she was about to say next. "Marcus, there's something else I need to tell you. Something personal." Marcus felt his heart rate increase as she moved even closer to him. The professional distance they'd maintained was disappearing, replaced by something more intimate and dangerous. The feelings I've developed for you over the past 6 months have compromised my judgment, she said quietly. I've been taking risks and making decisions based on what you would want me to do rather than what's strategically smart. Marcus stared at her, feeling a mixture of shock and relief at her admission. Sarah, let me finish, she interrupted, using his first name for the first time since they'd begun working together. I know that any personal relationship between us would be inappropriate and potentially devastating for our careers. But I also know that if we're going to expand this investigation to include the civilian conspiracy, we need to trust each other completely. Marcus understood what she wasn't saying directly. They were about to embark on an investigation that would make them targets of people with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. In that environment, the only protection they would have would be their absolute trust in each other. Sarah, he said carefully, I need you to know that my feelings for you haven't affected my professional judgment. Everything I've recommended during our investigations has been based on what I thought was right, not on what I thought you wanted to hear. She smiled slightly. I know. That's one of the things that made me fall for you in the first place. The admission hung in the air between them, changing the fundamental nature of their relationship. Marcus knew that from this moment forward, they would be partners in a way that went beyond their professional duties. If we do this, he said slowly, if we expand the investigation to include the civilian conspiracy, we'll be putting ourselves against people who have already proven they're willing to commit murder. I know. And if we pursue a personal relationship while conducting this investigation, we'll be vulnerable to blackmail and other forms of pressure that could compromise our ability to protect our sources and witnesses. I know that too. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. Finally, he made his decision. Then, we do both, he said firmly. We expand the investigation and we pursue our personal relationship, but we do it smart. No public displays of affection. No overnight stays that could be documented, and absolute honesty with each other about any pressure or threats we receive. Admiral Mitchell nodded her agreement. And if either one of us becomes a liability to the other, we walk away from the personal relationship without question. Agreed. She moved the final step closer to him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body. In that case, I need to ask you something that's been bothering me for months. What? That night at Fort Harrison, when you found me in that detention facility, how did you know you could trust me? How did you know I wasn't actually a dangerous prisoner who deserved to be locked up? Marcus thought back to that night, remembering the fear and desperation he'd seen in her eyes. I didn't know. I just knew that whatever you'd done, you didn't deserve to be treated like an animal. And now that you know who I really am and what I was doing there, Marcus reached up and touched her face gently. Now I know that you're the kind of person who's willing to put herself in danger to protect other people. And I know that's exactly the kind of person I want to be with. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, he could see both vulnerability and determination in her expression. Marcus, if we do this, if we expand this investigation and pursue our relationship, there's no going back. We'll be committed to seeing it through no matter what the consequences are. I understand. And you're sure you want to take that risk? Marcus thought about everything that had led him to this moment. His principled stands that had cost him promotions throughout his career. His decision to investigate the crying he'd heard at Fort Harrison. His choice to accept the position in the Military Ethics Oversight Division. Every major decision in his life had been about choosing to do what was right rather than what was safe. Sarah, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. She smiled and moved closer until they were standing so close that anyone watching would have no doubt about the nature of their relationship. For a moment, Marcus was acutely aware of how vulnerable they were making themselves to surveillance and blackmail. Then Admiral Mitchell reached up and pulled him down for their first kiss, and all his concerns about professional propriety and personal safety disappeared. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily and looking at each other with expressions that mixed desire with determination. Well, she said quietly, I guess we're really doing this. Both parts of it, Marcus confirmed. The investigation and the relationship, as they stood together in the hotel room, both knowing they'd just crossed a line that would define the rest of their lives. Marcus realized that some of the best decisions were also the most dangerous ones. Tomorrow, they would begin expanding their investigation into a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government, and They would do it as partners in every sense of the word. The war against institutional corruption had just become deeply personal, and Marcus couldn't think of anyone he'd rather fight it alongside than the woman who'd been willing to risk everything to gather evidence against her own institution. Outside their window, the lights of Fort Braxton glowed in the darkness, holding secrets that could shake the foundation of American democracy. But inside the room, two people who understood the price of moral courage were preparing to pay whatever it cost to protect the principles they'd sworn to defend. 7. The explosion that destroyed Marcus's apartment happened at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, exactly 1 week after he and Admiral Mitchell had decided to expand their investigation into the civilian conspiracy. Only luck had saved his life. He'd been staying late at their temporary office reviewing classified documents when the building went up in flames. By the time the fire department arrived, there was nothing left but charred debris and the clear message that someone wanted him dead. Admiral Mitchell arrived at the scene within minutes of receiving Marcus's call, her face pale with fear and anger as she surveyed the destruction. They both understood that this wasn't a random attack or even a simple assassination attempt. It was psychological warfare designed to demonstrate how vulnerable they were and how far their enemies were willing to go to stop the investigation. "They're escalating," she said quietly as they stood together watching the firefighters search through the wreckage. "Which means we're getting close to something important." Marcus nodded, though his mind was still processing how close he'd come to death. If he'd been following his normal routine, he would have been asleep in his bedroom when the explosion occurred. The fact that he'd survived was either incredible luck or divine intervention, depending on your perspective. "Sarah, we need to talk about changing our operational security protocols. They obviously know where I live, which means they probably know everything about our personal arrangements." Admiral Mitchell was already thinking along the same lines. "We're moving you to a safe house tonight, and I'm requesting federal protection for both of us. This investigation is now officially being conducted under threat conditions." Over the next 3 days, as they worked from a heavily secured federal facility outside Washington, D.C., Marcus and Admiral Mitchell began to understand the true scope of the conspiracy they'd uncovered. The torture techniques being developed at military bases across the country weren't just experimental programs. They were operational tools that had already been used in domestic counterintelligence operations. The evidence they'd gathered painted a picture of a shadow organization within the intelligence community that believed traditional constitutional protections were obstacles to effective national security operations. This group had been systematically developing methods to circumvent legal restrictions on domestic surveillance and interrogation, using military personnel as unwilling test subject for techniques they planned to use against American citizens. "Look at this," Admiral Mitchell said, pointing to a classified document she'd obtained through her security clearances. "Operation Domestic Shield. It's a program designed to identify and neutralize American citizens suspected of terrorist sympathies before they can act." Marcus read over her shoulder, feeling his anger build as he processed the implications. They're talking about preemptive detention and interrogation of people who haven't committed any crimes. Just people who fit certain psychological profiles or have expressed political views that someone considers dangerous. And the interrogation techniques they're planning to use are the same ones we've been investigating at the military bases. Techniques that constitute torture under any reasonable definition of the term. The scope of the constitutional violations they were uncovering was staggering. American citizens were being targeted for surveillance and potential detention based on their political beliefs, their ethnic background, their religious affiliation, or simply their psychological profile. The program represented everything the Constitution was designed to prevent, and it was being implemented by people who'd sworn an oath to defend that same Constitution. "Sarah, we have enough evidence to bring down this entire program and everyone involved in it. The question is whether we can get it to the right people before we're silenced permanently." Admiral Mitchell had been thinking along the same lines. "I've been in contact with a federal judge who specializes in national security cases. Judge Harrison has agreed to hear our evidence in a sealed proceeding that would allow us to present everything we've discovered under legal protection. When? Tomorrow morning. But, Marcus, you need to understand what we're risking by doing this. Once we present this evidence officially, there's no backing down. We'll be committed to seeing this through to the end, regardless of what that costs us personally." Marcus looked at her across the desk where they'd been working for hours, noting the exhaustion and stress that marked her face. Over the past week, their relationship had deepened under the pressure of constant danger. They'd learned to communicate with just a glance and to trust each other's instincts completely. What had started as attraction and professional respect had evolved into something much more profound. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Always. Do you regret starting this investigation? Do you regret getting involved with me personally when it's put both of us in so much danger? Admiral Mitchell stood and walked around the desk to where he was sitting. She placed her hands on his shoulders and looked directly into his eyes. Marcus, 6 months ago, I was a flag officer with a successful career who followed orders and stayed within the boundaries of acceptable behavior. I was also profoundly lonely and increasingly disgusted with the corruption I saw around me, but felt powerless to challenge. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Meeting you changed everything. Not just because I fell in love with you, though that's certainly part of it. You reminded me why I became a soldier in the first place. You showed me that it's possible to have principles and stick to them even when it costs you everything. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion as he listened to her words. So no, I don't regret any of it. Not the investigation, not our relationship, and not the risks we're taking. Because for the first time in years, I'm doing work that actually matters, and I'm doing it with someone who understands what it means to serve something bigger than yourself. Marcus stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as he processed the weight of what she'd said. Tomorrow, they would present evidence that could bring down a conspiracy at the highest levels of government, knowing that doing so would make them permanent targets of people with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. Sarah, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that this investigation and our relationship have been the best thing that's ever happened to me. You saved my career and probably my life when you gave me the opportunity to do meaningful work. We saved each other, she said softly. And tomorrow we're going to save a lot of other people too. That night, as they prepared for what could be their final mission together, Marcus reflected on the path that had brought them to this moment. Everything had started with his decision to investigate the sound of someone crying at Fort Harrison. That one moment of moral courage had led to the most important investigation of his career and the most meaningful relationship of his life. The hearing before Judge Harrison took place in a secure courtroom with no public access and strict confidentiality protocols. For 6 hours, Marcus and Admiral Mitchell presented evidence of torture, illegal detention, murder, and a conspiracy to violate the constitutional rights of American citizens. They documented every aspect of the programs they'd uncovered and provided testimony from dozens of victims and witnesses. Judge Harrison listened to their presentation with growing alarm, asking pointed questions that demonstrated his understanding of the legal and constitutional implications of what they were alleging. When they finished their presentation, he ordered an immediate federal investigation with authority to prosecute everyone involved in the conspiracy. Admiral Mitchell, Major Chun, the judge said formally, "The evidence you've presented today represents one of the most serious challenges to constitutional government this court has ever reviewed. I want you to know that this investigation will proceed with the full authority of the federal judiciary behind it." As they left the courthouse, Marcus and Admiral Mitchell both understood that they'd crossed a point of no return. The conspiracy they'd exposed would fight back with everything it had, but they'd also set in motion legal proceedings that would be difficult to stop or suppress. 3 months later, the first arrests were made. High-ranking officials in the intelligence community, military officers at bases across the country, and civilian contractors who participated in the illegal programs were taken into custody on charges ranging from conspiracy to murder. The scope of the prosecutions was unprecedented in American history. Marcus and Admiral Mitchell continued their work with the Military Ethics Oversight Division, now operating with expanded authority and resources provided by Congress in response to the scandal they'd uncovered. Their relationship had evolved into a partnership that was both professional and deeply personal, built on shared experiences and mutual respect that had been tested under the most extreme circumstances. 1 year after the explosion that had nearly killed Marcus, they were married in a small ceremony attended by fellow officers who'd supported their investigation and family members who understood the risks they'd taken to expose the truth. The ceremony took place at the Memorial Chapel at Fort Harrison, which had been converted into a monument to the soldiers who died trying to report illegal activities at military installations. as they exchanged vows in front of people who understood the price of moral courage. Marcus thought about the night he'd heard crying in the darkness and made the decision to investigate. That single moment of choosing to do the right thing despite the personal risk had led to everything good in his life. Admiral Mitchell, now his wife as well as his commanding officer, had taught him that sometimes the people who look like they need rescuing are actually the ones doing the rescuing. She'd given him the opportunity to serve something bigger than himself and shown him that love and duty weren't incompatible when both were grounded in shared principles. The war against institutional corruption would continue for as long as there were people willing to abuse their authority for personal gain. But Marcus knew that as long as there were also people willing to risk everything to protect others, the principles the Constitution was designed to defend would survive. Standing in that chapel with the woman who'd changed his life, Marcus understood that some stories don't have neat endings because the work they represent is never truly finished. But they can have new beginnings, and sometimes those new beginnings are built on the foundation of courage, sacrifice, and love that refuse to be intimidated by those who would abuse their power. The mountains around Fort Harrison stood silent witness to their vows, holding secrets that had been exposed and justice that had been served. But they also held the promise of continued vigilance and the understanding that freedom requires constant protection from those who would destroy it for their own purposes. Marcus Chun and Admiral Sarah Mitchell had found each other in the darkness of institutional corruption, and together they'd helped ensure that the light of justice would continue to shine for future generations of soldiers and civilians who deserve protection from those who would abuse their trust. Their love story had begun with a cry for help in the darkness, and it would continue with their shared commitment to ensuring that such cries would never again go unanswered.